SLAYsmr channel where every week I whisper my thoughts about a different horror movie that I love. This week, we're talking about 1981's Halloween 2. Very different from Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Before we start, a quick disclaimer, if you will. So, I don't know if you all have noticed, but the angle of how I film this tends to change every week. And last week, for the Trick or Treat episode, I had settled on something that I finally liked. I felt like I'd figured it out. I marked it on the floor. I decided that was how we're going to film this from here on out. Obviously, the camera is much closer right now, and I have a very good reason for that. So, my wife and I are watching a friend's dog, and she's so sweet, but she's older, and she gets a little anxious sometimes. And she's been staying here in my back office where I film SLAYsmr. And she was sleeping in here, and I was moving around the office, kind of getting my setup to how it is normally when I film these. And she was getting so nervous and so scared, and I felt like she thought something really bad was going to happen, and I couldn't bear to keep moving around the office, so I didn't bring in the tripod. I didn't move all the furniture around like I usually do. I just set up a little mini tripod here on the desk as to not bother her further. I was really worried I was going to stress her out. You may have heard her just now. She's sleeping on the floor. So that's the other disclaimer for this episode. You may hear dog snoring in the background, and I would apologize for that, but I actually get ASMR tingles from dogs snoring, from dog noises, dogs sipping water even. All of that does it for me, so maybe it does it for you too. And if it doesn't do it for you, I totally understand if you have to turn off this episode right now. But just know that I'm not going to kick the dog out. She's sleeping on the floor right now. It's really cute. She's really cute. She's with us today, so if you hear some snoring in the background, that's who it is. Just pretend it's Laurie Strode snoring in a hospital bed in a drug-induced stupor, because that's where we're at with this movie. So, 1981's Halloween 2, More of the Night He Came Home. I saw this movie very shortly after I saw the first Halloween. I loved it so much when I saw it when I was 12 years old that I just wanted to seek out every sequel immediately. And that's the story of how I saw this film. Not as drawn out. I think sometimes when we see a new horror franchise that we really love, there's all this build up to the story of how we watched the first one in the series and all the hype we heard about it. But I feel like the sequel's not so much, because if you like the first movie, chances are you're going to go out and you're going to find and devour all of those sequels very soon afterwards. So I probably saw this maybe a night or two after I saw the original Halloween, because I liked the original so much and I wanted to get this one at the video store. And like the first one, the premise is very simple. It picks up, no joke, seconds after the first one ends. Actually, it picks up with the first one. The first, I'd say, 5 minutes of this movie are actually the last 5 minutes of the last movie. So we start off in this shot in the trees above Tommy Doyle's house, and we don't hear the Halloween theme. We actually hear the Chordette's classic song, Mr. Sandman, which normally is very much, I think, an innocent type of song, a cheery type of song. And this is one of the first horror movies I can remember seeing that took an innocent song and repurposed it for something sinister. Another movie I can think of that does that is Lady in White with Lucas Haas, which maybe we'll do that one day on the show. They do that with the song, Have You Ever Seen a Dream Walking? Well, I did. And this does it with Mr. Sandman. And it almost gives the movie a false sense of safety at the start. We see this very peaceful shot of the trees blowing in the wind. We hear the quartets, and at first you're like, oh, well, maybe this is something else. Maybe we're not going to start this in dark fashion. Maybe we're going to get a moment of reprieve, a moment of innocence. And the camera pans down, and suddenly we see that we're at the Doyle house, and we hear Laurie's last bit of dialogue from the last film. We hear her saying, I want you to go to the Mackenzies, call the police, and it's so chilling because just for a second we thought that we're safe, and then we hear, oh no, we're back at this night again. No, not only that, but no time has elapsed. It was the first movie I really saw that did that. I could be wrong. I think the Friday the 13th Part 2 came out this year, and they do a similar thing where they show the last few minutes of the previous film and then go into the next film, which actually became kind of a staple of a lot of the Friday the 13th sequels. They would always start with the last one left off. However, with the exception of one or two entries, most of those movies don't take place in the immediate aftermath of the first movie. The first scene might, but most of them jump forward a year, maybe even more. Halloween 2 is different in that the rest of the movie, after we see this opening, still takes place on October 31st, 1978. I mean, if you were to run the movies back to back, we're seeing maybe a few hours in a single day. So it's a lot that happens in a very compressed amount of time. So yeah, we see the last few minutes of Halloween. We do get a few variations. The one that I think about is we see Michael Myers get shot and fall off the balcony from behind rather than from front. So we see the house where he stumbles out and falls. And it's such a big blooper. You can see that they had to raise some kind of platform so that his feet were essentially even with the balcony rail, so he just had to walk backwards rather than hit the railing and stumble over backwards. I always thought that was funny. And then we see the immediate aftermath of Dr. Loomis running down to the front lawn and looking at the imprint, the shape left, and seeing that there's blood there and that the shape is not dead. And then you have this great bit of dialogue with the neighbor who comes out, who thinks that Loomis tells him to call the police, and the neighbor thinks it's some kind of prank. And he says, is this a joke? I've been trick-or-treated to death tonight. And Loomis, of course, says, you don't know what death is. And then we kick into the theme. I can't remember if we talked a lot about Donald Pleasance in the last episode, the first episode where we covered the first Halloween, but I love that. Every line he delivers is almost this bit of Shakespearean or Dr. Van Helsing type dialogue. We had someone on the Halloweenies podcast recently, and we weren't talking about Halloween, but it came up somehow. And this guy's a therapist. His name is Mike Snooney, and he's on the Psychoanalysis podcast. Wonderful person, wonderful therapist, wonderful podcast host. And he talked about how Dr. Loomis, in a way, is like the worst therapist to ever be portrayed in film, because he's at the point where he has thrown all science and diagnosis and a clinical outlook out the window. To him, Michael Myers is evil embodied. He is supernatural. And so that's why everything that comes out of Loomis's mouth is this, like, a great pearl of a line. Like, oh, you don't know what death is. And we get a lot more of that in this movie as more revelations come up about Michael Myers in the evening. So immediately the premise is that we're just continuing the night that happened in the first movie. And Laurie gets brought to the hospital, Haddonfield Memorial Hospital. And Michael Myers pursues her. That's pretty much it. And Dr. Loomis is trying to find Myers, and he's joined by Nurse Marion Chambers from the first movie, and as well as a state marshal. You get a new Brackett kind of character, because Brackett very early on is taken out of the movie. As soon as he finds out his daughter Annie is dead, he's out of commission, and understandably so. And one of his deputies, Deputy Hunt, who I always thought looked like Jeff Daniels, takes over. But it's funny because eventually, even though there are a lot more characters in this movie, there are more people that Michael kills before he gets to the hospital, and then in the hospital there are a ton of night workers, not to mention the nurse Chambers and the federal marshal. There's a much bigger cast, but I mean, it really does winnow down to Loomis, Laurie, and Michael, even though we meet a lot of other people. So, before we get to the hospital, after the credits, we see Michael just patrolling the back streets, the back alleys, trying to stay out of the view of the police. He goes into an old couple's house and steals a knife, and then randomly just goes next door and kills another young woman. Now, this scene is disputed a lot because on Twitter, myself and the other Halloweenies guys, and I think just Halloween fans in general, they debate the meaning of that. If Michael is trying to hide out or avoid the cops or find Laurie, why does he go and just kill this random girl next door? And the true answer, of course, is that John Carpenter did not want to write a sequel, but he got pressured to by the studio, him and Debra, and he pounded a 6-pack of beer and cranked this thing out in a couple nights, I think. Maybe it was a 12-pack. And by that point, the ante for gore and kills had been amplified by Friday the 13th and Friday the 13th Part 2 and all these other movies that Halloween indirectly inspired. So Carpenter has said that he felt pressure to include more overt scariness, overt violence. Now, it's funny because the popular narrative about this movie for a while, at least in circles that I run in, was that the director Rick Rosenthal was the one who pushed for more violence and more of the gore and more of the traits that didn't feel like the first Halloween movie. That's actually not true. Supposedly, Rosenthal's cut was a lot more subtle and did not rely as much on blood and violence, and Carpenter saw a test print of it and came in to gore it up a little bit, for lack of a better word. So that's probably why we get that kill early on. But a lot of people have tried to psychoanalyze and figure out why Michael would do that. Steph Hutchinson, who wrote the Halloween comics from Devil's Due Publishing a while back, he has a theory that for him, it's a rage kill. It's the first time in the night we've seen something not go Michael's way, and that he got shot off a balcony by Loomis, and he's in a panic, and he can't control himself, and he's angry, and it's a rage. He kills her out of pure rage. Steph brought up a good point. We have an interview coming out with him on the Halloweenies podcast. He brought up a good point that that's the first time in either film where you really see Michael's eyes when he has the mask on. When he kills Alice, you can actually see a close-up of Dick Warlock, who is the stuntman who plays Michael in this movie. You can see his eyes. He looks very human, and he looks very angry. And I like that theory a lot. Once again, I think it's really just because they needed a kill early on in the movie to keep the momentum going, but I think that's a good explanation. And we should talk about the eyes real quick. I love this movie. It's funny, I feel like I've criticized it a couple times so far, but I really, truly love this movie. I actually probably get more scared by it than I do the original Halloween. I love Dick Warlock's performance. I really do think this feels like a genuine continuation of the first one, both in spirit and in plot and in character. But I don't like that we see his eyes so much. Even as a kid, I remember that felt weird. Something that's great about the first movie is that you really don't see his pupils behind the mask, and I don't know if that's because they put fabric there or if Dean Gundy was just able to light it a certain way, but that first film, you see Michael Myers' eyes when his mask comes off at the end, and that's about it. Otherwise, they're two blank holes, which to me just lends itself to the neutrality of him as a killer, the blankness of him as a killer, the idea that everyone always talks about where you can project your own fears onto his face, which I don't believe in. I actually just think the mask is scary, but regardless, part of why it is scary is because we can't see his eyes, and in this movie, I feel like you can see his eyes in almost every shot that he's in, and you get used to it eventually, but it is a little bit strange. Although if we were going to go with Steph's interpretation situation. I could see a case that things are not going so well for him this night. He's becoming more deranged and more frayed at the edges, more worried, and we get a sense of angrier, like Steph said, and we get that conveyed a lot more when we can see the eyes, so you get used to it. But I remember thinking it was a little bit weird even as a kid, especially because as far as I know the mask is the same from the first one. The hair looks a little bit more teased out and fluffy, but it is that mask from the first one, so I'm not sure how they got the eyes not to show up in the first one, but you definitely see them here. And I will say too, something that I think Rosenthal carries over from the first movie that really makes it feel like they have the same DNA as this use of the periphery. I've always said I think Michael Myers is scariest not when he's jumping out at someone or popping out of nowhere, but when we just see him slowly looming in the background, and there is a lot of that in this movie very early on too. When he steals the knife at the Elrod's house, the Elrods are the older couple whose house he goes to. You see it from his point of view. He goes into the house through the back. The wife is making a sandwich, and the husband is asleep watching Night of the Living Dead. And you're seeing it all from Michael's point of view, and then they cut to the foreground where the television is, so you can see the husband, you can see the wife, and then you actually see Michael just for a second right behind her, and then he steps out. Same thing when he goes to Alice's house next. You see his point of view. And then you see her on the phone with a friend, and you just see him silently stepping in the background, so we still get a lot of that really silent, casual background periphery movement, which I just love. Later on in the film, this might be, in my opinion, the creepiest shot. After he successfully infiltrates the hospital, there are two nurses, Mrs. Alves, who's sort of the head night nurse, and Karen, who is in charge of the maternity ward with the babies in the hospital. You just see Michael wandering the hall, and he ducks into the nursery as Karen walks by so he can hide. And then we cut to a conversation with Miss Alves and Karen, and you just see Michael in the nursery amongst all these babies. You just see his face, and then he kind of casually walks out. And I feel like we always see these periphery shots right after we've seen it from Michael's point of view. So Rick Rosenthal does this great thing where we're following Michael. We know he's in the other room because we've just seen him go in there. And then he shows it from their side of it, him going out. I don't know if the first movie does that as much. I feel like the first movie is more, they're showing the characters, the would-be victims, and then he's just kind of there in the periphery. And this movie does that too, but we see his point of view taking him into the periphery, which connects everything and allows you to play detective, or not detective, but Where's Waldo with Michael Myers a little bit more. I just love that. We get so many good background shots of him when he eventually kills Karen and her boyfriend Bud, who's an orderly, or an EMT. In the hot tub, he turns up the volume on them, or turns up the heat on them. It's the same thing. We see him in the background by the thermostat. He corrodes Bud, and then he shoves Karen in the hot tub. And when this movie came out, it got a lot of criticism for how violent it was. And people aren't wrong about that. We do see a lot more of actual gore. When we see Alice in the beginning, we see, a lot, probably more blood spurt up from her stab wound than we see in all of the first movie. Even when they show Annie's body, her neck is bloodier than in the first movie, where it was just like a red line of blood. The hot tub scene, we see like burned skin peeling off of a face. We see a hypodermic needle in someone's eye. It is a lot more graphic than the first movie is. But I feel like what most critics didn't get when it came out is that the movie, in many ways, was having it both ways, right? Yes, it was more violent, but it was also honoring the techniques from the first movie and honoring the characters and honoring the themes. It still feels so in line with the first movie as far as its universe goes that, to me, it doesn't bother me if we see some more blood. Who cares, right? It's still scary in the same way the first movie is scary. It ups the stakes with the body count, and with the fact that Laurie is in a narcotic stupor for a lot of the movie, it knows how to escalate. So it's that rare sequel that I think pays accurate tribute to the first movie, builds upon it, and then also gets to do some of its own fun tricks with it. So the gore and the blood are not really that much of an issue for me. And honestly, even with all the torture stuff I just mentioned, I think it still kind of pales in comparison to a lot of modern horror movies in terms of the violence. I actually just watched all of the Saw movies over the past 2 weeks or so. So maybe I'm just getting conditioned a little bit too much to watching that kind of thing. But watching the Saw movies and then watching Halloween 2 right afterwards, it still feels like a pretty tame film to me. I feel like if it aired on AMC, I mean, I know they have the TV cut that they show, but say this was made for AMC, I actually don't think it's any more violent than The Walking Dead or Breaking Bad or anything like that. So reading those criticisms in a 2020 context feels a little funny and quaint to me, because I actually don't think it's that violent. Another reason why this movie really does feel like a very strong connection to the first one is because they brought back cinematographer Dean Cundey, who to me is such a huge reason why these movies feel the way they do. I may have mentioned this on the Halloween episode, but Dean Cundey almost uses theatrical lighting in these films. When you look at Michael Myers, he's always bathed in some kind of concentrated monochromatic light, red, green, yellow. The example I always bring up is in the first movie when Tommy is looking out the window at Michael Myers across the street at the Wallace house. He sees his silhouette, and it almost has a floodlight on it. It doesn't look natural, but it's this floodlight that backlights him so we can really see the silhouette clearly, but it looks like something you would see in a play. And then when he goes back to the window to look again after he's got Laurie, Michael is gone, and that light is gone too. And it's actually such a stark contrast, it almost doesn't look real, because why would a light be following this character around, right? I think that's because of Dean Cundey and Carpenter wanting to really play up saturation versus minimalism and isolation when it comes to lighting, and it just gives Michael that really supernatural, eerie feel without actually having to confirm that he's supernatural eerie, without having to go into Mark of Thorne territory, you know. I feel like Michael's mysticism in this comes from the fact, from how he's portrayed, rather than plot details, if that makes sense. Like in later sequels, we found out, oh, he's invincible because of this druid cult, because of these rune stones, blah blah blah. And here it's like, no, I have a suspicion he's mystical or indestructible or pure evil because of A, the way Loomis talks about him, and B, the way that Dean Cundey and John Carpenter light him. Or I guess in this case, Dean Cundey and Rick Rosenthal. I would say we see even more of that in this film. There's a scene at the end where Michael is stalking Laurie through the hospital parking lot, and he emerges from, I guess it's an emergency exit light. It's just this wash of red light in the parking lot, and he's just lit completely red. And once again, that's not how it would look in real life. That is how it would look if he was on a stage with a red gel light beaming down on him. But it doesn't bother me because it almost gives you the idea that he is somehow controlling the environment and actually morphing his physical environment around him, that he's actually making the lights do something different everywhere he walks, and that's really creepy to me. It's funny because that scene that I'm talking about toward the end of the movie, I've seen these movies a million times. I know every shot that Michael's in. As a kid, kind of like I did with Jaws, I would go through and just watch all the Michael scenes and pause it and try and spot where he was in the background, because especially in these first two movies, there are moments where you might miss it the first time around, where he's just lurking and there's not a lot of attention drawn to it, and you could easily skip it. That being said, when I lived in Chicago, we were over at my friend Mackenzie Gerber's house. Mac is he's on Halloweenies, if any of you are Halloweenies listeners. We were over there to watch Halloween 2, and we all realized that you see, before you see him in that red light, you see him walking parallel to Laurie for just a few seconds, so he's kind of in the shot before the music cue happens and a little bit before Laurie sees him, and none of us had noticed that before, even though we'd seen the movie, dozens and dozens of times by that point. So that was kind of cool, being in my 30s and having seen the film before, to get surprised like that during what was just a more or less a casual get-together with friends. That was really cool. And that's what I love about these early Halloween movies, the periphery, the fact that there are little tricks you maybe would not have noticed the first time around. So that's Dean Cundey, and he even does it in a couple of choice scenes that don't involve Michael Myers, when Loomis and Brackett are driving around, and when later on Loomis and Deputy Hunt are driving around. There's this green dashboard light that is illuminating Loomis, and I don't think Loomis is supernatural by any means, but he seems the most connected to that semi-mystical world that Michael Myers operates in. I think because he's the only one who really believes that about him, aside from Laurie later on. So I feel like lighting Loomis like that actually gives him an even more direct, faithful connection to Michael Myers. So, big hat tip to Mr. Dean Cundey. It's funny because he also did Jurassic Park and a lot of bigger budget pictures later on. And those movies are lit magnificently also, but I feel like Jurassic Park has a very different look to it than Halloween or Halloween 2. I guess it does similarly rely on shadows, especially with how they depict the T-Rex when we first see it, but Jurassic Park to me feels a lot more naturalistically lit, and that's a testament to Dean Cundey's skill that he can do both things, that he can operate in both aesthetics, right? So we've talked a lot about going to the hospital. Alright, one more thing before we move on to the big other plot point of the movie, is that in the beginning, it really has nothing to do with the rest of the film, but in the beginning we see this little kid in a pirate outfit going to the hospital, and this description's a little graphic, although I guess I've been pretty graphic on this episode. We see him just holding a kind of a washcloth to his mouth, and it falls away, and we see it's a razor blade. I guess the implication being that someone put a razor blade in an apple or his candy or whatever, which is a Halloween myth, right? I don't know if that's actually happened in real life or not. Maybe it has. But I think what the writers and director are doing there is playing on this Halloween urban legend. And as a kid, I always thought it was an ice cube. I thought he had done something to his mouth and it was bloody, and that an ice cube was sticking out of it. And once again, going back to things we noticed later on about the movie, I didn't notice until a few years ago that no, this kid bit into a razor blade. It's really disturbing, and it doesn't connect at all to the rest of the movie. They leave the hospital pretty quickly. It's not like that kid is a main character even around. Michael Myers doesn't kill him as far as I know. It's just this weird, gross moment that I think really heightens the mood of Halloween 2 and shows you, no, we're in a different place. We are escalated from where we were in this first movie. And then I can't help but wonder, was Michael Myers maybe responsible for that razor blade? Was Michael Myers just walking by houses and finding candy buckets and sticking razor blades in them? Probably not, right? I asked Steph this question earlier today, and because he actually uses that motif in one of the comics, Michael Myers does put some razors in some candy, but he was like, Michael was pretty busy that night. I don't know if he could have gotten around to that, but maybe who else is doing that if Michael Myers is not the one putting razor blades in candy? Who is it? Is there someone even worse than him in Haddonfield? I don't know. But yeah, I just think that moment is really creepy, even more creepy for the fact that they don't really comment on it. It's just a thing that happens. It's a mood setter, it's a tone setter, it's a warning, a foreshadowing of how violent this movie is going to get. So yeah, I just think it's a really cool moment that they have in the beginning of the film. As we go on, Loomis is going to find Myers, but he goes to get retrieved by Marion Chambers, the nurse from the first movie, along with the federal marshal. And we find out got adopted by the Strodes, who were family friends of the Myers, and she had repressed the memory, but is kind of remembering it in the movie. And then, of course, Loomis and Marion confirm him. A lot of people take issue with this plot point, and I don't know, when I saw it as a kid, it did not bother me. I think where it gets a little convoluted is that it forces the sequels to go to a much more complicated, and not in a good way, place, a much more convoluted place when it comes to the mythology and how they're connected. I can buy the fact that, okay, maybe Michael is trying to recreate the death of his other sister by finding this one, but it's that thing where the more information we get about why Michael is doing what he's doing, the less scary it is. It really doesn't bother me within Halloween 2, independently of all the other films, but once we get to 4 and 5 and 6, we have Jamie, who is Laurie's niece, and the bloodline plot becomes part of this greater cult, and it becomes more ritualistic. And I think when we get to that point, that's when I wish the bloodline thing had never happened. I know a lot of people think that it was thrown in there because The Empire Strikes Back had come out around this time, and they were just trying to rip on that. And you actually saw a lot of horror movies in the 80s and 90s really leaning into this bloodline element. Friday the 13th did it with Jason Goes to Hell. Nightmare on Elm Street did it with Freddy's Dead. Just this idea of the killers being related to their victims. Anyway, I just thought it was worth bringing up. Like I said, it doesn't really bother me in this movie in of itself, but I do think it causes problems for the series later on. And then the Halloween that came out a couple years ago, they just chose to disregard it, which I have mixed feelings about that too, but I'll save that for when we get to that episode. It's funny too, I know I started SLAYsmr with my Halloween episode, and I'm already doing Halloween 2, not a couple months later, and I thought about that. I'm like, oh, am I going too fast? Is this too soon to reintroduce a Halloween film to the SLAYsmr channel again? But then I thought, I'm like, no, you know what? I will probably do an episode on all of them, except for Resurrection at some point. Even 5, which I know a lot of people hate, I have a soft spot for. I've come around to liking the Rob Zombie movies a little bit more. Definitely the second one, I don't know, maybe not the first one. Point being, I just love Halloween as a series. It's my favorite horror franchise, so I think it makes sense to do an episode on each of the films, except for maybe Resurrection, and maybe that first Rob Zombie one, but all the other ones we'll talk about eventually. Some other things I love about this movie. One that really comes to mind is just what we get to see of Haddonfield. We actually probably don't get to see quite as much of the streets and the neighborhoods as we do in the first movie, but we get to see the hospital. We get to see a shopping center when Michael Myers walks by a kid with a boombox and hears that Laurie's at the hospital. We get to see back alleys and backyards. We get to see a lot of elements of the town that we didn't in the first film. We get to see the elementary school. And what I love about it is that everything is decorated, but I feel like in the 70s, maybe I'm wrong on this, I wasn't alive then, but I feel like in the 70s, you maybe didn't get the colossally over-decorated Halloween houses that we do now. One of my favorite things to do with my wife in Atlanta is walk around the neighborhood we live in and see all these elaborate Halloween displays, and I feel like that maybe was as much of a thing back in the 70s. Maybe it was, like I said, correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like the decorations you saw were more of the dollar store variety and the paper cardboard cutouts, and you see a lot of that in this film. I actually feel like you see more Halloween decorations inside than you did in the first movie. The first movie, we see some jack-o'-lanterns, we see some trick-or-treaters walking around, we see the ghost imagery, but I feel like in this movie we actually see, in the hospital, there's a cardboard witch hanging on the wall, and we see paper pumpkins, and in the school we see Halloween themes written on the chalkboard. Halloween as a holiday just feels like more of a presence in this movie. Even the kid with the razor blade, I feel like this film is really leaning more into the imagery and the tropes of Halloween, which is super scary to me. I said on the Trick or Treat episode how vintage holiday decorations for Halloween are a lot creepier to me than some gory mannequin you would see on someone's lawn, and I think this film really leans into that aesthetic. Totally random. I'm kind of going on a tangent here. Also, I actually really like all the supporting players they have in this film. Rick Rosenthal at the time, I think, was either taking classes or working at the Beverly Hills Playhouse, so he turned to a lot of theater actors who he knew, like Pamela Susan Shoop, who plays Karen, and Leo Rossi, who plays Bud. Leo Rossi, I mean, oh, bless you, Murphy. That was the dog. Told you she was there. You okay, girl? Oh, she's so sweet. I'm gonna leave that in there because, like I said, maybe a dog sneeze is very ASMR-y for you. Leo Rossi, I think he's really funny in this movie. He's just a total macho jerk. Has some great lines. Like, he's not actually funny. He's a guy, I think if you met him in real life, you'd be like, yeah, he's kind of a jerk. He's saying jerky things. He's shoving his stick and whatnot. But he also feels very real. I feel like we've all worked with a guy like that. The guy who maybe you tolerate, but he says stupid stuff and stuff that maybe no one has the heart to fight back against him on, if that makes sense. I definitely worked with a guy like that at a hotel I used to work at. I wouldn't even say the guy was someone I didn't like. He was just someone who would say things and you just kind of roll your eyes and they're like, alright. And so Leo Rossi just excels at playing that kind of role. And if you watch films from the 80s, he pops up all the time in similar roles. I just watched the film River's Edge and he plays the stepdad in that. And yeah, I don't know, he's just really good at playing blue-collar jerks, and he's someone who, whenever he pops up in a film, I'm always happy to see him, and I feel that way about a lot of the character actors in this film. We do have Lance Guest as Jimmy, the orderly, who, I don't want to say falls in love with Laurie, but there's definitely some flirtation there, and he's great too. Lance Guest, who of course went on to be The Last Starfighter, directed by Nick Castle, who played the Shape in the first movie. He just brings an innocence to the role, which makes him really endearing, especially when stacked up against someone like Bud, who's maybe a little bit more unlikable. It's Jimmy's fate in this is interesting too, because he walks in on Miss Alves' body, which has been drained of all of its blood off screen, and he slips in the puddle and hits his head really hard. And later on, we see him wander to his car while Laurie is running from Michael, and he passes out on the steering wheel, and the honking alerts Michael to Laurie's presence, and then we don't see him again. Now, I'm an optimist, so I choose to believe that he lived, and in the Halloween comics, he does live, although he's beleaguered with seizures after that because of his head injury. And then we'll say things don't go so well for him as the story progresses. And then there was a deleted scene that was in some of the TV cuts where Laurie gets taken away in an ambulance at the end, and a shape behind her rises, and you're worried it's Michael, and it turns out it's just Jimmy, and he's being treated for his injuries, and they go away together. But in the movie as it is, the theatrical version, it's interesting. He passes out in his car, and you never see him again. You don't know what happened to him. And I feel like, I don't know if that was just because they didn't have time to film something, or if it was a deliberate choice, but that actually feels like a pretty bold move to not have them get together or something at the end. And the film does that with a lot of its characters. Jimmy is positioned to be some kind of hero, and he just, he slips in blood and he passes out or dies. Sheriff Brackett is out of the picture in the beginning, which makes a little bit of sense given what's happened to his daughter. But even Deputy Hunt, who takes over for him, he more or less disappears after the elementary school scene. And yeah, like I said, I don't know if that was the result of Carpenter and Hill and Rosenthal really wanting to deliberately show what small town life is like. People come in your life, they go out of it. Or if it was to show how cruel the world of Halloween is, where people just aren't given a ton of weight, and whether it's because of death or them just disappearing, they're in and out, or if it was just a result of sloppy screenwriting, where John Carpenter had that case of beer and just didn't think to resolve all these loose ends. Whatever the case, I actually think the movie is stronger for it. It's creepier for it. The fact that we don't know the fates of so many of these characters, even the nursery that we see, there's definitely a good number of babies in that hospital, and the hospital gets blown up at the end. They go in the operating theater and Laurie shoots out Michael Myers' eyes, and while he's blindly trying to swipe for Loomis and her turn on all the gas, and they blow it up, they blow him up, they blow the hospital up. And there's babies in there. So what happens to them? I don't know. I'm assuming that not the entire hospital got ignited, and that the babies got out and they were fine. I feel like we would hear about it if a bunch of babies died in this explosion. But regardless, I think in other horror movies they would have to show what happened to the kids and all the other patients at the hospital. They would have to confirm, oh, we got everyone out, or we managed to get the babies out. And this, they don't. You're left to interpret it how you see fit. And once again, I'm not trying to say at all that the film is killing all these unseen patients. I'm just trying to say that I think it's a bold move to not have to give the audience that exposition. It feels like it's trusting its audience, even though it's getting kind of clunky in exposition with the brother-sister stuff. And yeah, like I said, not sure what the reasoning is behind that. It may have been less deliberate than I'm making it out, but I think the movie is stronger for it regardless. And then certain things I think you just have to let go and disregard, especially when it comes to the sequels, right? Like the fact that, as I said, Laurie shoots out Michael Myers' eyes. And I've heard some people say, when you question that, when you're like, well, how is he seeing in the fourth movie? How is he getting around? He was blinded. A lot of people will say, oh, well, he got shot, right here and right here. And the blood was just dripping into his eyes. But even then, he got shot close range with what looks to be, I don't know a ton about guns, but at least like a .357 Magnum slugs. That's pretty serious. So I don't want to get into horror movie logistics nitpicking about how he would survive something like that. Point being, I think with every Halloween sequel, they're just things you have to let go and accept, right? And that's one of them in that ending. We've gone a little long tonight, haven't we? But I love this movie for all the reasons we've already outlined. It's bigger and better than the first film, while also feeling very much in line with the first film. And that same night, and like I said, I don't know if I watched this more than the first movie, but I do think it scares me a little bit more because we see Michael Myers' reach get to expand, and we get a little bit more of the supernatural quality from him without them having to really lean too far into over-explaining that. I don't know if any of you have read the novelization of this, which was ghostwritten by the great Dennis Etchinson, who I think also ghostwrote the first novelization. And what I love about that, and it's a very Etchinson type thing to do, is that when Michael Myers is walking throughout the hospital and the hospital's getting darker, which in the film I think it's supposed to be implied that he's cutting out the power, but in the book and the novelization, Etchinson almost describes him as exuding shadow and actually physically sucking the light out of all this physical space. It's really cool, it's really eerie, and once again it really even ties even more to that supernatural element without full on coming out and saying, oh, Michael Myers is some kind of immortal ghost or demon. So yeah, that's why that movie is a lot more terrifying to me in many ways than the first one. Also, when I first moved to Chicago, it was actually fairly close to Halloween. It was Halloween or October of 2006. And I had been getting headaches for a little bit, and I was really worried about it. And I went to the hospital. I lived in the Lincoln Square neighborhood, so I went to the Swedish Covenant Hospital, which is just in walking distance from where we lived. It's the hospital where Harrison Ford was born, I think. And I just walked to it to get checked out because I think my health insurance covered emergency room visits, so I was getting worried about these headaches, so I think I went and they did a CAT scan. I was fine. I think I was just being neurotic, or it it was psychosomatic or something, I don't know. Point being, I was in a hospital in Illinois on Halloween night, and after I got back, I remember I watched Halloween 2, and it freaked me out even more because when I was sitting in that hospital waiting room, and there weren't a lot of people there because it was Halloween, and I was looking at all these cheap Halloween decorations, just looked to me a lot like Haddonfield Memorial, and hospital corridors are kind of creepy anyway, and I remember just wandering through that hospital and walking home and being convinced Michael Myers was in there right behind me. So I think this film will always tie back to that. Oh, one more thing. Many years later in Chicago, this would have been 2016, I actually wrote a 10-minute play about the Halloween mythos. It's a father and son kind of debating the movies, and then Michael Myers shows up at the end. It's called Haddonfield South, and it takes place in South Pasadena. The night that we opened that play, as part of a short play festival, I was making a burrito and I accidentally cut myself really bad. I cut my hand open, and I thought it was fine. I bandaged it, and then we're watching the play, and I could actually see blood seeping through the bandages, and it was kind of clear I needed to go to the hospital, get stitches. So my friend who directed the play, he dropped my wife and I off at this same hospital, Swedish Covenant. At this point, almost 10 years later, it wasn't Halloween night, but I just, watched a play with Michael Myers that I wrote, and I was back in this hospital, so I feel like I will always associate Swedish Covenant with Michael Myers and with Halloween. Halloween 2 specifically. Man, that hospital setting is really creepy. I think maybe even creepier than any of the settings we go to in the first movie. That's Halloween 2. Directed by Rick Rosenthal. Written by John Carpenter and Debra Hill. I love it. I love that you're here to hear me talk about it, so thank you. You can also, of course, check out our Halloween 2 episode on Halloweenies, our podcast, all the way back from the first season. I think we did that episode in 2017, 2018. I'll post the link for it in the comment section below. And I will also post the subscribe button if you want to subscribe, and of course like and tell your friends. Next week, we're getting closer and closer to Devil's Night, to All Hallows Eve, to the holiday we all love, or the holiday I love best. We're gonna keep the Halloween theme going. Next week, you're gonna get another Halloween-related SLAYsmr, but it's going to be something different. All I'll say is that it's going to be tied to the Halloween universe, but it's going to be a type of video we haven't done before, and it's a type of video that I'm very nervous about doing, and I'm worried I might embarrass myself, but I made a promise to myself that I'm going to do it, and who knows, maybe it will be really good and different. I don't know, that I could also see it being really goofy. That doesn't matter though. I'm going to film it this week, and we're going to try it, and I'm going to post it next Monday, and I hope to see you there, and I hope you dig it, and I hope I don't bungle it, because I could see myself doing that. It's something I'm not used to doing, so it'll be a welcome challenge. Until then, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're safe. I hope you're happy. I hope you're relaxed. I hope you're getting good sleep. I hope you're finding some joy in what's obviously a very strange moment in our world right now that hopefully will be over very soon. I think it will. So yeah, all those things. Get some sleep. Don't have nightmares. Unless they're the good kind. Alright, we'll see you next week.